Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the ECA Learning Zone for tonight's webinar. Today, we're joined by Jake Green and Tim Benstead once again from the Scolmore Group. Today, Jake and Tim will be discussing the need to maintain lighting levels should there be a power failure, and how, as a contractor, you can best comply with BS 5266, I hope that's the right one, and associated standards as well. Today's presentation is 30 minutes long, roughly, with a chance for Q&A at the end. Today's webinar is being recorded, and if you're watching us on the YouTube channel, do make sure to check out all the rest of our webinar series on the channel and at eca.co.uk. And that's it from me. So with no further ado, over to Jake.
Thank you very much, Omar. Appreciate the kind words there. So yeah, today we're going to be sort of going through 5266 emergency lighting and talking about some of the standards that are associated with it and what you really need to do as a contractor when it comes to this standard in particular. Typically, we would look at BS 7671 as a contractor, and all of the other standards that are in there, we sort of park them to one side. But this standard's a little bit different. So what we're going to do today is try and explain to you exactly where you need to look when it comes to this standard and the associated ones with them as well. So, Tim, this isn't legislation, is it, when it comes to 5266?
No, you're right, Jake. 5266, as with any code of practice published by the BSI, is just that. It's a code of practice. It's guidance and recommendations. We can treat it as industry good standard, but the issue is there is legislation that sits behind it, and therefore it would be wise for us to conform to the recommendation of 5266, because it sort of answers the question about what is it, how is it we actually maintain the requirements around the regulatory reform fire safety order. Which we can see from the screen requires in clause 14 that emergency routes and exits must be indicated by signs, and in H there, emergency routes and exits requiring illumination must be provided with emergency lighting of adequate intensity in the case of the failure of the normal supply. So legislation just undergirds everything that we'll be thinking about over the next half hour or so. And the second bit of legislation, of course, that sits there is the building regs. That's been sat there since 2010 and before, and again it requires that there is appropriate means of escape in the case of fire from a building to a place of safety outside the building, and so those two bits of legislation undergird everything that we're going to chat about over the next half hour.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when we start to look at building regulations. We've been doing some work recently on building regulations in particular, and sort of just overarching them all together. They seem to sort of get forgotten about. They always go away and people just go, oh, they're there, we know they're there, but no one ever refers back to them. I know they haven't been updated in some time, but it might be useful for you guys that are watching tonight, guys and girls that are watching tonight, to just refer back to it. Even if you go online and download the document the one that sort of hoovers it all up in one hit, just to refresh your memory of building regulations. And we've had some interesting conversations over a week or so where people have gone, oh, do you know what, I didn't remember that, or I didn't know that, especially around part L. I know we're not talking about that in particular tonight, but it'd just be good if you just go back and refresh your memory on all building regulations. So in terms of standards, then we've got a few different standards that we're going to be sort of crossing between. I mentioned right at the very beginning that, let's go back there, very beginning, that actually this standard, although in 7671 there are other standards, generally speaking, you don't really go and have a look at all those other standards. But this one in particular requires you to go into 3 or 4 different standards to make sure that you are getting the correct sort of lighting levels, the signage, the colours, etc. Would it be fair to say, Tim, that this isn't quite like the other standards?
I think you're right, Jake. It's Whereas we get away with not necessarily referring out to too many other standards within 767, as you rightly say. You know, it refers out to 5266, it refers out to 5839 and what have you when we sort of dip into it. But 5266 is in many ways peculiar in its relationship to, in particular, BSEN 50172 and BSEN 1838, which are the two, if we like, harmonized documents we can take on board. They are an integrated whole, and 5266 on its own isn't really enough to cut the mustard. You could perhaps get away without having to get hold of BSE and ISO 7010 or the automatic test facilities standard of EN 62034. As manufacturers, we wouldn't be able to get away with that, but as contractors, you rightly would expect manufacturers to get that sorted. But for designers and installers of emergency lighting systems, then 5266, 50172 and 1838 hang together.
Indeed.
It's worth probably just noting, isn't it, Jake, that it's likely that BSEN 1838 and 50172 will be renewed sometime next year. There's certainly been worked on, and most of that work's been done, and so it's likely that there'll be new publications, and they'll be dated 2024.
Would that indicate then that 5266 is going to be updated at some point if they're sort of doing work on that, and then at the back end of the year perhaps?
Yeah, it'll probably drift that way, certainly, but it's 5266 is being and will be worked on more when those other two get finally published.
So the following functions of 5266 are as follows. You've got emergency escape lighting, you've got emergency safety lighting, and you've also got standby lighting. So that 5266 standard covers all those three parts in particular. Now, when we start to look at, sorry, go on.
I was just, can you go back to that one there, Jake? It was interesting. Again, we have some interesting conversations, don't we, when we go down to these various shows and people ask questions. I had one chap talk to me about, they've got this very whifty thing where they've got their normal supply, but they've also got UPS, and they've got backup generator arrangements. And his question related to emergency lighting was, isn't that enough? You know, we've got a week's worth of fuel for our generator. We can keep powering the normal supply of the whole building quite happily for days. And that more than complies with the recommendations of 5266 and what have you. And of course, it was a very neat arrangement. And of course, it would meet the requirements of the standby lighting and potentially even the emergency safety lighting, but certainly the standby lighting. But the problem is for emergency escape lighting, what happens during a fire when circuits are popping, not simply that the normal supply maybe hasn't failed, but circuits are failing within that. And so it sort of is important that we're clear about what we mean by each of those three areas.
I think, again, it's important to note as well, Tim, we always speak about in the point of need. And it's important that actually this emergency lighting system at the point of need needs to work.
Yeah.
So, you know, he raised a good point, but at the same time, it's kind of like, well, this is where we are. We need to make sure that any time that there's something that fails, we need this system to operate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just like any other standard as well, the scope matters. And what I mean by that is that scope outlines what the document covers and sort of limits it to that, tidies it up in a nice little box and just says this is exactly what it's going to do and what basically it's saying it's not going to do. So the design, installation, wiring of electrical emergency lighting systems to provide the lighting performance needed for safety of people in the building in the event of a failure of a supply to normal lighting. But it also applies to all of these types of building occupants required to leave a building during an emergency if they stay in a building during an emergency and continue normal operations in the event of a failure to the normal supply lighting.
That's it. Yeah, scope's critical. You must read it before you open up the rest of the standard.
I think that's true as well when we look at other standards, and people go, oh, this regulation states this, and it's like, oh, hang on a second, you realise you're in this part of the regulations. You know, you need to take that out to one side and look at the part you're actually trying to refer to. So this is taken directly from the standard itself. It just gives you a quick overview of you know, what's required and how to sort of come to a conclusion of where you need to be. So you've got emergency lighting. Is it standby lighting or is it emergency escape lighting? If it's emergency escape lighting, you've got escape route lighting, open area lighting, high risk task area lighting. So all of this needs to be defined when you're sort of designing a system.
Yeah, and you have to get that critical, don't you, with your client and the other designers of various other systems.
Oh, keep jumping ahead. I'm not used to having just one screen, so. So when it comes to the safety lighting aspect of it, Tim, what do we mean by safety lighting?
Right, we differentiate in terms of emergency escape lighting from other types of lighting, like standby lighting and emergency safety lighting, simply because emergency escape lighting has that single function of, during fire, when all else is failing, that gives you sufficient light for you to escape to a place of ultimate safety. That's that whole sort of remit. When you drop into other types of emergency lighting, like standby lighting, emergency safety lighting, you're allowed a wee bit of slack, a wee bit of time. So it might be that you need to do some shutdown processes. And so emergency safety lighting takes place because you've got to go, I need to shut this down in this order, I need adequate lighting to do that safely. And when that happens, then we can move on out. And it may be that you know, if it's people are only there during the day and there's adequate daylighting, that might be sufficient. It's all to do with managing a process until you leave, but that's not emergency escape lighting. And in the same way, when you touch on to standby lighting, that's back to what that chap was talking about, is what happens when, well, standby lighting is just keeping things running at normal levels pretty much. But at some point, you've still got to have sufficient energy within the storage system, the battery, to enable people to then emergency escape light on their way out. And again, that usually locks into about an hour capacity left.
So when it comes to sort of designing one of these systems, we've identified, or the standards identified, that there are all of these types of people. I'm going to do it again, and I'm going to jump forward. Apologies. So all of these people here need to be consulted when it comes to designing an emergency light system, and it's very important that this happens. And the reason it's very important that this happens is because when we start to look at the owner / developer of properties, we've just mentioned the fact that, you know, there's a possibility to have to shut down machinery for a period of time. What normally happens is someone will say, here's a drawing, go ahead, install it, and we want it to install to this. And you think you're doing a great job, you've done all the handover, etc., etc. The problem lies when someone actually then moves into that building, the owner or developer is sort of pushing the building out, and all of a sudden, this person who's moved in now has machinery, and that machinery is going in all sorts of different places. And the emergency lighting system that you've put in, that's been designed for you, no longer is sort of adequate. It's no longer adequate to serve the purpose it was intended to in the outset. So it's vitally important that throughout this whole process, you are having conversations and consulting with people to say, right, okay, we understand this is just a shell scheme. However, do you know what type of person is going to be moving into here? Do we need extra signage? Do we need extra lighting for task lighting, etc.? And really, Tim, it's just to sort of get that understanding between what's expected and what is actually being installed. Yeah,
no, that's right, Jake. I mean, the list is important. I mean, the responsible person is a defined term in legislation, in the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, and so when you that person ideally needs to know what he or she is taking on after the handover. The owner developer, as Jake rightly says, has to have some idea of what they're going to be using the building for, and it just works its way through. Now, you may not, it may be that you don't need to talk to the DNO. There may be other things that provide relevant services, but all of these, there should be part of the thought process pre and during design to take account of any changes and modifications that may need to take place as you're working through it. But absolutely critical discussion, talk before you're trying to then commission it at the end when it's a bit late in the day.
So all of this that's on the screen now, again, needs to be consulted with when it comes to what are their procedures. We can see there on the screen whether it's a stay put strategy, and ensuring that, you know, make sure that it's intended and it's appropriate, the system that you're going to be using.
I mean, it can be, Jake, as simple as saying, well, actually, we've gone through the process, we've done this emergency evacuation, there's been the emergency lighting system has done its job properly, and what have you. We can let everybody back in. But then you ask the question, how long does it take to recharge the batteries so that you could then do it again? Are you suddenly allowed back in with a system that may not then subsequently deliver within an adequate time frame? It's all of these sort of discussions and conversations have to take place. And unless you've got the agreed procedures in terms of testing and certification and the rest of it that sits in there right at the front end, when you come out the other end and you are maintaining a system and you are, as Jake rightly says, needing to have that, it's got to work at the point of need, and you've not thought about it at the beginning, it seems a bit strange, doesn't it?
Indeed. So you can see there as well that the system designer needs to know the area types of premises to be covered, number and location of occupants. Again, that could play a factor into the size of signage, the distance between the people that are working in, let's say, the middle of the building. I'm thinking more of like a factory setting here, the middle of the building compared to actually out on the edges. So again, that would play a part onto the size of signage, location, and of the exit routes. This is an interesting one as well. When you start to think about the plans, they need to be available as early as possible so that people, again, like that list we've just shown, can have conversations and determine whether the plans that they're going to put forward are suitable for it as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these critical things. I know that the companies like Scolmore provide a service for the design, don't they, Jake?
Indeed.
But they can't design into a vacuum. There's all sorts of information that such a design organisation would require, and that's part of the previous slide, but also part of this. Without those accurate plans, without some idea of how the building is going to function, a design inherently is going to be constrained. But it's important here, particularly as the plans are there on escape routes, that we're referencing the right standard. Suddenly you're into the EN 50172 and the EN 1838 because we're into emergency escape lighting and not simply the more general emergency lighting.
I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball at you, actually. Escape routes.
I feel like I'm good sleeping now.
Escape routes as well as protected escape routes. So what do we sort of have to enhance in that? Is that a consultation as well between people in terms of what's required for a protected escape route?
In terms of 5266 and the other related standards, there isn't really a difference in terms of light levels. They're not defined separately in terms of light levels, glare, illumination, and the whole 9 yards that goes with that. Protected escape routes are tied into, shall we say, the nature of the surrounding building that says that within this space it has a certain element of fire resisting quality. the light levels are the light levels, and 5226 doesn't differentiate between them. Fortunately, not too much of a curveball. Protected escape routes and escape routes under emergency lighting. I'm only talking emergency lighting here, not 7671. But insofar as emergency lighting systems are concerned, you would expect to see emergency lighting systems within protected escape routes.
Now, records, they must be kept as well.
Yeah.
This is when you start to talk about fire and 5839 Part 1. Within that, there is a certificate of acceptance, and I know it's not quite on the same level. I'm just trying to sort of relate it back to something, but it's vitally important that the records are kept in the same way that 5839 Part 1 talks about it. Records must be kept in order to understand what's happened to that system over a length of time. Have they been tested? Have the luminaires been changed since the first installation? Is all the photometric data there? You know, these things actually matter when it comes to proving that these luminaires or the luminaires are actually working correctly, and just making sure that everything's all in order. The last thing you want to happen is something to fail, and this information's not been kept in detail.
Yeah.
Copies of records. Sorry, go on, Tim.
No, sorry for interrupting, Jake. It goes back to the issue. It's law under the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, and we keep going. And what happens when things go wrong? And when things go wrong and these records aren't in place, the legislation comes and gives you a real kicking, rightly so. And so records matter.
And as well, just thinking back to sort of my example right at the beginning, is that you've sort of done a shell scheme building, and all of a sudden people have moved in, there's machinery going in. You know, you want to have records to say that, you know, we've even if there's no changes, you want to have that record to say we have thought about, do we need to change this, or do we need to alter this system in order to comply with the pieces of machinery that we've now got in place? If you don't need to do anything for it, then fine. At least you've documented to say we have had some consideration as to what's going to happen to the unit now that we're in play.
Absolutely spot on, Jake. Yeah, absolutely critical.
So in terms of the design, I'm just going to put all these up on the screen here, and I've done it again. We're not going to run through every single one of these points, pretty much because we've only got, believe it or not, Tim, we've only got 5 minutes left, and we've got a lot to get through.
So, talk fast.
Talk fast.
I think. Go on, Jake. Sorry.
So what we're going to say about all of these points here, and again, I'm just going to jump through the rest of them for design here. All of these points should be treated almost, if you're doing the design, as a tick box exercise, similar to what we see on the, forgive me for the word now, the 7671 certificates, the memorandum of tick boxes that we see. Simply treat it exactly the same as that. So just go through it and just say, right, have I covered this? Have I done this? That's the easiest way to sort of look at this from a design perspective.
And it does. What I'm going to say is it reinforces what you said earlier about going back and having a look where the machinery is going to be and where the rest of it is. Part of that just kicks in exactly the same.
I'm going to jump again. Sorry guys, I can't see the slides in the way that the next one's coming along. So again, for the illuminance itself, so the plans, the positions, again, treating this like a tick box. There's lots of tick boxes here to say, right, have I checked this? Have I made sure I've got this correct?
Yeah.
If you work through it as a part of a process, you can't really go too far wrong. Then we're on to the system side of things. And this is all documented within the standard as well. So you know, print it off, keep it as something on your desk to say, there we go. We've made sure that it's all there.
Yeah. And it's also to remember, Jake, isn't it, that you're still having to conform to BS 7671 where relevant.
Indeed. So when it comes to circuit protection and controls, again, it's very simple. It's not difficult to necessarily design circuits for emergency lights, but however, they must be designed in such a way that the switches, isolators and protected devices are fit for purpose, and just like any normal circuit would be when it comes to that. Making sure that you've got a well-established siting for the test facilities as well. You know, it's no good having a key switch locked away in a cupboard where no one's got a key to, or the day that you need to go in and carry out some maintenance. It needs to be somewhere where someone can get access to it, you know, if they want to do a flick test or sort of drop test, if they want to just check that. Again, these things all matter when it comes to that. Oh, that's us done, Tim. I've jumped right through there. I don't know what's happened there.
We've cantered through that last three. I think Jake's right. There's within the standard, it's actually fairly straightforward. It's quite easy to use this 5266 in leading you through the process. But what you can't then do is ignore the recommendations that exist within 1838 and 50172, because 50172 talks about maintenance side of things, and we haven't been able to touch upon the issues around maintenance and the requirements of a responsible person on that side. We haven't talked about logbooks, have we, Jake, and the need to continue to maintain that. The certification that kicks in, do we have more than 25 luminaires or fewer than 25 luminaires? A whole raft of stuff we've clearly not been able to cover with regard to it, but then there's a lot of work to do in such a thing, and the courses are not just half an hour long.
Indeed. Now, so as Omar said right at the beginning, that we'll take some questions if there is any. We have one that's dropped into here for us, Tim. It's do all existing systems need to be compliant with current 5266, i.e. updated to comply, unlike say sockets without RCD protection in BS 7671?
No, you'd be forever updating, and it wouldn't be fair. What you've got to, I think, what would be right to do within any installation is to get the responsible person to ask, are we still covered, such that it would be adequate. That's not the same as saying I must update. It's saying keep thinking about it so that you're not caught out. Should there be, because the building's changed, the circumstances have changed. Don't just assume that a system is still going to deliver what you want it to deliver. So no, you don't need to update every time there's a new standard, although it doesn't happen as often as it does with 7671. We're all pleased to sort of say. But even so, I would still sort of train the responsible person to keep asking the question.
I think you raise a good point about the training of the responsible person as well. You know, typically the people that are the responsible person don't necessarily have qualifications within the businesses, but they always sort of jump from one job to the next. So, you know, I'm just thinking of it from a business point of view for you guys to keep touch with the business that you're working for. You know, just drop a little call in, just say, has anything changed, or do we need to have any further training? You know, just that continuity and just keeping in contact with them as well.
Even do you want a review of the system?
Have you changed anything within the building? Has there any been walls been put up? Do you need to have us to have a look? Just to, you know, I think instilling confidence in those people that are the responsible person as well, and building that rapport between the yourself and them, you know, to give them that confidence to know that they're okay being a responsible person. Because when you actually sit there and you explain it out to them, a lot of people go, oh, I didn't realise I was quite responsible for that.
Yeah, it's quite scary actually, if you've got no technical knowledge and suddenly you're confronted with, this is what the law requires of you. Is this what you're doing? And you often they'll go, no.
Indeed. A couple more questions then. I find that emergency lighting testing is not asked for as much as 7671 testing inspections. Do others find this? Maybe because you've done such a good job in the front end, and you've explained it to them, and you said, look, these need to be tested X, Y, and Z at these set intervals, and they're doing a good job. We can't emphasize enough, and I think it just goes back to what we were just saying a minute ago about having that conversation and finding out that responsible person, because if they're not testing it, and then as we've said right from the beginning, in that time of need for the system to work, they need it to work. So, you know, it's really important to, if you feel like some of your customers are not necessarily having, or they're not taking it as serious as 7671 test and inspection, drop them a call, just say, you know, these things do need maintaining, and so on and so forth. But no, it's a great point. You raise a great point there. Oh, here's one then. Do self-testing lights meet regulations?
Yes.
I thought it was going to be it depends.
It depends. As with anything. No, they're detailed within the standard, and I mean, the issue, I suspect, the question, perhaps I'm being a bit facetious, is when it comes to the drop test. I suspect lies behind, and not just, and so you're looking at a whole system test that looks at the loading and the nature of the storage and the recharge times and things that sit around that. Treat that as a separate thing. But yes, the self-testing luminaires are contained within the standard and referenced accordingly.
So somebody's asked here that the qualifications, Tim. I know we've briefly mentioned that the new 5266 is probably going to be back end of next year. They're asking, is there a qualification required, or will they still have, or will they still be up to date as such when it comes to the new standard? Also, how do we know or recognise a competent designer or company?
Yeah, there is. I mean, there are companies out there doing training that we know. It's not as common as training in fire detection and fire alarm systems. It's not. It's. I think it's a wee bit of a Cinderella area, emergency lighting, although it's critical. There is the BAFE scheme does have registration for designers and installers of emergency lighting systems. So there is a scheme to be that. What people need to be aware of is organisations such as the NIC and what have you do not assess against 5266. They assess against the fixed wiring element as it relates to 7671. And so it's to be careful that you don't mistake that annual assessment scheme for an assessment against the 5266 standards.
Yeah, so I mean, they would probably look at the wiring of said emergency lighting, but not necessarily the design. Or
is it the right light levels? Are they the right type of luminaires? And all of that isn't assessed.
I think it raises a good point there with regards to how do we recognise a competent designer or company. Yeah. You know, it's one of them things, one of them standards. As long as you're using it constantly, and it's like all standards really. If you're using it constantly, then it's it doesn't take too much. But if you're dipping in and out of it for a long period of time, then it might be good or wise to refresh yourself before you start designing them again. Yeah. Does anyone have any more questions for us before we decide to leave you to evening? I know the football's going to start sometime soon. I can see on the screen there that Dortmund are losing. Oh, sorry, Dortmund are winning 2-0 against Newcastle. So I'm sorry to any Newcastle fans out there this evening.
I think that is it for all the questions that we had. So thank you once again to Jake and Tim for another excellent presentation, and to our viewers as well. Final reminder that this webinar has been recorded and will be up on the ECA YouTube channel very shortly. And do check out the rest of our technical guidance and materials on the members area of the ECA website, and on the ECA YouTube channel as well, to see the whole series of Learning Zone webinars. That's it from me. Jake, Tim, thanks again, and have a great evening.
No worries. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks everyone.
Cheers.